Welcome to the tutorial. This is going to be a tutorial on the Section 7 guidelines for the Monarch CCAA application. And today we have Dan Salas and Phil Delphi, who are going to walk through the Section 7 guidelines document that you can find on the CCAA toolkit.
All right, thanks, Iris. Can you see my screen?
Yep, sure can.
Excellent. All right, so yeah, we want to talk through the guidelines for preparing your application, but this component specifically is for the Section 7 consultation piece. And so if you haven't checked out the other recording of how to prepare the application itself, I encourage you to check that out. And then here we'll talk specifically about the Section 7 attachment, where you have to consider the potential effects to other listed or proposed plants and critical habitats. So this guidance document we'll walk through you can find on the Monarch CCAA Implementation Toolkit on the UIC website. So if you found this video, you're likely there already. And I guess as we start off, this guidance document is organized to sort of summarize the intent. We'll walk through the step-by-step guidelines very briefly. We'll share the example that's included, and then show you some of the other resources that are in the guidance document. And then we'll also wrap this up with an example of a real-life example of a Section 7 analysis that was provided as part of an application. So as we start that, I guess I'll turn to you, Phil. Do you want to just give a quick summary of why applicants have to think about these potential impacts and Section 7 considerations as part of their application?
Yeah, sure. Whenever a federal agency takes an action that may affect species listed as threatened or endangered or critical habitats, that agency has to ensure that the action it's taking is not likely to jeopardize any of those species, and also that it's not likely to destroy or adversely modify any critical habitat that's been designated. When we wrote the biological and conference opinion on our issuance of the permit associated with the CCAA and just our approval of the CCAA, we looked at the effects at a really broad kind of a programmatic level. We're looking at of course, it's a nationwide agreement. We didn't know at that time exactly where activities would be implemented. We didn't know exactly the entire scope of the entities that would apply for certificates of inclusion. And so we couldn't really do any kind of an analysis or describe specific measures that would make sure that we were in compliance with Section 7 as the federal agency taking this action. And because of that, we had to describe how we were going to make sure that we were going to do what's necessary under Section 7. Just like I said, we had to describe a process, measures that would be taken as part of the CCAA that would ensure that we would not jeopardize any listed species or destroy or adversely modify any critical habitat. And we also had to include proposed species and proposed critical habitat in that as well. And so once we know, based on who applies for certificates of inclusion, then we begin to know where the types of activities are going to be implemented and also where those activities are going to be implemented. So we can use that information to understand what species might be affected, what critical habitats might be affected. And it's, as you'll see, and as you may already know, we treat in this process that we've developed specifically for the CCAA, we treat animals differently than we do plants and critical habitat. And that's because no partner to the CCAA can implement any activity under the agreement that would result in take of any listed animal species or any proposed animal species. And so we think that that is sufficient to ensure that we won't jeopardize any listed or proposed animal species. But there isn't anything similar to that. There's no such thing under the law as take of plant species. The prohibitions for plants are described differently. And the same goes for critical habitat. So we had to set up a process, and basically at that broad programmatic level, we had to describe a process that would ensure that once we understood what plants and critical habitat might be affected by the activities, that the applicant and the potential partner would commit to certain measures that would avoid or minimize effects to any plants or any critical habitat that could occur in areas where that partner would be implementing activities under the CCAA. And so really it's making sure that the Fish and Wildlife Service as the federal action agency is in compliance with Section 7. Otherwise the agreement itself would no longer be legal. So this is required to ensure that the service is in compliance with Section 7, which of course protects the agreement as a whole.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's helpful to understand, why we're doing this. I know some applicants have sort of asked, why we have to commit to some of these other considerations. So it's helpful to have that sort of big picture perspective on this up front. So thank you for that. All right, so let's dive in then to the details on how you do this. We'll get next into these step-by-step guidelines on how to actually work through this process for your application. So what we require as part of the application is the submission of a full species list and critical habitat list, and a list of avoidance minimization measures for plants and critical habitats, specifically those that have overlap with monarch habitat. And so step one in that is just to generate that full list of endangered, threatened, and proposed species that occur on the extent of the enrolled lands that you're applying for under the CCAA. And so even though you are only providing avoidance minimization measures for the proposed or listed plants and critical habitats, we ask that full species list, again, to your point, Phil, that you made, that one of the requirements is that we're avoiding take of wildlife. And so acknowledging what those species are that are listed, as far as fish and wildlife are concerned, sort of acknowledges that. And then again, we're focusing those measures that you're developing specifically for plants and critical habitats. So how do you generate that list? Partners may have their own ways of doing that. One sort of default option that we recommend is using IPAC, so the service's online portal, to generate lists of federally listed species that occur within a geographic area. You can also have state lists, maybe generated from your local natural heritage database. And then some partners I know do a lot of active consultation on their projects, and so they maintain their own lists that are fairly up to date and active, that they've been developed in coordination either with their state or with the service, across their footprint. So whichever starting point you use, that's great. Summarize that. Let us know how you derive that list and include that in your application attachment. All right, then next under step 2, and I guess maybe before we move on to step 2, Phil, did you have anything you wanted to note about the list of species that's provided by the applicant?
No, I guess we provide and we state in the guidance there that you have different options for obtaining the list. And IPAC is always a good resource, even if you use other sources. And one thing that we've mentioned previously is that in IPAC, you always have the choice of getting an official species list or not, or just kind of formal species list. That doesn't really, what that does is it sets up an internal tracking number for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it makes it easier for the Fish and Wildlife Service field office that will eventually be reviewing the AMMs to kind of track down a record of your IPAC query. So I would encourage you to if you use IPAC, to go ahead and request a formal species list, because it could facilitate and kind of streamline the review that's eventually done by the field office.
Great, good to know. And just for those watching, so we keep referring to AMMs, and you'll hear us refer to that repeatedly. So that's avoidance minimization measures. That's a mouthful. So AMMs is our, our shorthand for that. So speaking of that, that is the next step of the process. Is once you have your list generated, then we ask you to describe your AMMs that you're proposing for those listed or proposed plant species and designated or proposed critical habitats. And so we'll go through a couple examples of that, so you have sort of a frame of reference to use there. But as you do though, as you prepare those AMMs, there's a few important considerations to include here. So the format that you're providing them in, while a lot of applicants are providing their application in a PDF format and maybe some of the mapping in various formats, for the AMM attachment, that's really helpful if you provide that in a Microsoft Word document. That helps facilitate the review and any comments that the service will provide as part of their review. The sources for your AMMs, so aside from having the AMM itself, describe sort of the resources or the source that you use to develop that AMM. So if you maybe coordinated locally with your Fish and Wildlife Field Office to develop that, note that and maybe who you've worked with there. If you referred to species guidance that's available online somewhere, you can refer to that. But let us know what you use to develop that. Next is considering also the effects of adjacent activities. So as you prepare those AMMs, right, so as I briefly mentioned, you're only required to provide AMMs for those listed or proposed plants and critical habitats that have overlap with monarch habitat. So nectar plants, milkweed cover, in those types of areas, because those are the areas where take is possible, and therefore that's where the enhancement survival permit that's associated with the CCAA essentially takes effect. So in those areas of habitat. So if there's potential overlap from species, those are where those AMMs apply. Now that said, some of those effects to other listed species might occur in adjacent areas as a result. So you have to think about that if, let's say there's carryover from like herbicide treatments or different activities that might impact habitat that's adjacent to an adopted acre. And so by and large, we're talking primarily overlap, but you want to think about the adjacency. And so if you know a mapped population that's really close to an adopted acre or adjacent to it, you want to make sure you consider that appropriately. Next is essential habitat features. And so as you're looking specifically at critical habitats, reviewing the essential physical and biological features, these are sometimes called the primary constituent elements. Oftentimes these are only found sometimes in the Federal Register, establishing documents for the critical habitat. So those do require sometimes some searching to pull those up. And Phil, we have your contact information here. So of course, if applicants are working on this and they have difficulty finding that or have questions, not just for this, but I guess for anything with the Section 7 application requirements, they can reach out to you. I guess next we'll talk to you about providing sufficient detail. So you want to make sure with your AMMs that we're avoiding vague terms like limit disturbance or to the extent practicable. Let us know what that actually looks like. What is the extent practicable? Where does that apply? And having those specific details on sort of when and where and how those measures are applied really helps the service to understand what's being done and gives a high confidence level that those measures will be sufficient to avoid jeopardy to those species. And also, last, in terms of important considerations to think about, is avoiding making determinations. So that's ultimately the service's role, is to make determinations of what presents sort of adverse effects or jeopardy of species. So let the service do their job there. You don't need to do that, and focus on these other aspects to add those details that you need. So before I move on there, Phil, is there anything you wanted to emphasize based on the applications that you've reviewed thus far?
Yeah, one thing I want to refer back to are the essential habitat features of critical habitat. We refer to them as the PBFs, the physical and biological features that are essential as part of critical habitat. You really need, if you have critical habitat that is going to overlap with some of the activities that you implement under the CCAA, you really need to look at those features. Like it says in there, they were sometimes referred to as primary constituent elements. And I've written up just a short guidance on this that I think we'll probably post and maybe modify this guidance to incorporate. But you really need to get a hold of those. They're unique for each species that has critical habitat. And I just pulled together all of those for the species that have critical habitat in our Great Lakes region. And it is true that they're not always easy to find. And so please don't hesitate to contact me directly if you need help in finding those features. It's basically a list of features, usually about 5 features for each critical habitat.
Great. Great, good to know. So thanks for emphasizing that. Okay, so yeah, those are important considerations to include. And specifically, as we talk about the AMM sources, there are different places where you can obtain those from already. So obviously, if you're using existing AMMs, that's a great starting point for any of this. Of course, if you need to modify for your particular context, you have the ability to do that here at this phase, but the more you stick with existing AMMs, that obviously expedites the review, makes that a lot more efficient and quicker. So first off, you can check with your local ecological services field offices or their websites. Oftentimes there might be previous consults or coordination that derive AMMs or conservation measures from past projects or outreach that you may have done with the service. There's also some that information also available on the species profiles on the ECOS website. So there's links included in the guidance document that'll take you there. You can access that. There's also other species guidelines available through IPAC and through the resources list there. So for the Midwest region, we have a link there. There may be analogous guidelines for other regions. We just didn't have that available at the time that we put this guidance document together. And of course, there's other plans or resources available too. There could be state-derived avoidance minimization measures. There could be other conservation plans, other permit documents, things like that. So use a variety of sources, and again, provide those sources and reference those sources along with your AMM list. That's really, really helpful. If there is no avoidance minimization measures existing for that species, you can propose your own set. Again, reviewing the Fish and Wildlife Service will review and consult with the local offices on those. So again, you want to sort of base AMMs on maybe similar species or other species within that taxa to help sort of give a frame of reference for why those are. So we reference a few other things here, like the recovery plans, species profiles, thinking about the biological needs of a particular species, and how activities can avoid, minimize impacting those. We also, oh yeah.
Let me mention something really quickly. In number 1 there, it says in the recovery section, look for any 5-year reviews. Those 5-year reviews are just like it sounds, are documents that are typically written every 5 years to update the status of the species. Those frequently have really useful and up-to-date information to help develop AMMs. So if you're looking to develop AMMs for any species in particular, I encourage you to look in that species profile site to see if there's, and take a look at any 5-year reviews that have been prepared for that species.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice. Thank you. All right. So we also, for species that don't have other AMMs, we do have a list of, a master list of conservation measures or avoidance minimization measures that are sort of generalized. So those are there, and you can look at different types of activities. We can go through the example here shortly. But again, that was sort of an amalgam of like a Google search to identify information or resources that might be out there. So we give a couple suggestions here for search terms as well. So again, providing a source and what you use to develop those AMMs is very, very helpful. So you provide all that information by species in your list, and again, provide that with your application. So what I'd like to do now is go through an example of what that looks like. We have an example nested within the application here. And so, again, we have this broken up into 2 tables, essentially. Table 1 is the applicability of AMMs for listed fish, wildlife, plants, and critical habitats. That shall be, proposed species that are within the enrolled lands and that may overlap with suitable monarch habitat. And so you can see here we have a list of this example. We have a list of federally listed species. We note the taxa, the status. Those aren't necessary, but it just helps to kind of give some framework. And then we talk about whether or not they overlap habitat. And so we have non-applicable for, again, the fish and the wildlife, because we're just avoiding take altogether on those species, again, unless you have another authorization for take from another permit. So as we look at this last column with monarch habitat overlap, you'll see then where we have examples where we're noting yes or no for a particular species, depending on its habitat requirements and the requirements of monarchs and their suitable habitat. And so then what we will then do then for any species that we've noted yes, there is overlap with monarch habitat, those are the species that get carried forward for avoidance and minimization measures development in Table 2. So as an example, and what we've seen with a number of applications is that oftentimes when you have a number of species that maybe of a particular taxa, let's say you have in this case plants, oftentimes the avoidance and minimization measures you use for one plant species might also occur for the other. And so you can have a sort of a overarching list of avoidance and minimization measures like we have in this example that apply to all those species that you need to have avoidance and minimization measures for. Now that said, there are probably species-specific considerations that you have to consider as well, and you want to account for that too. But by and large, if you are, let's say, conducting pre-work surveys, you're going to do that for pretty much any species. If you're providing a buffer around known populations of those species when you're working in the vicinity, those you're going to do to all species. Maybe some species require more of a buffer than others, depending on the activity and the species. But again, similar approaches there. Phil, anything you want to add about sort of overarching AMMs and considerations there?
Yeah, one thing, a lot of times applicants will include a measure to avoid doing certain things in areas where the species occurs. And that's good, but be sure to explain how you're going to ensure that when activities are going to be carried out in and around known existing populations. So you'll have to describe the steps that you'll take to make sure that you're basically not missing any locations where you could be carrying out activities where that species is present.
Okay, good to know. Okay. All right, so then want to share with Table 2, again, where we maybe have species-specific AMMs for, again, listed plants and critical habitats. Here, again, we're providing optional information as far as habitat. This can be helpful just for your own internal reference as you're thinking about where those species might occur. Again, if you don't know where those known populations occur, where would you suspect they might occur and want to use AMMs, like you're saying, Phil, where they may not be known, but likely. And then this is where you would then highlight your specific, species-specific AMMs, and again, referencing sources for how those were developed, what resources were used. So here, for this example of Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid, we have a hyperlink included to the Fish and Wildlife Service's website for that species. We do reference the 5-year review for that species, as well as the recovery plan, and in this case, some state guidance for that species as well. So again, that's helpful. That gives the service a framework by which they can understand what was considered in development of those AMMs. Here's another example for Phastus locoweed, which again, gives you an example of some species-specific measures and resources used there. So again, these can be helpful resources for you as you're implementing the plan. And then critical habitats. So this is where critical habitats would apply not just to plants, but also fish and wildlife that have designated critical habitats. So, you know, again, you're looking for ways to avoid, minimize impacts to the habitat itself in these cases. And so again, here we're looking at the critical habitat designation for sources. We're looking at BMP lists that are published for the species and those types of things.
Dan, one thing I want to point out, maybe you could have pointed out before, is that critical habitat is specific geographic areas that the Fish and Wildlife Service has designated in the Federal Register. And so it doesn't just mean important habitats, you know, small I for a species, but it refers to specific geographic areas. And that's one good thing about IPAC that you may not get from other sources, is because it's a federal designation, that all that information is in IPAC. And so as long as you accurately enter the geographic area that you expect to affect with your CCAA activities, that you'll realize the system will be able to tell you if any of those activities, your enrolled lands, overlap with any critical habitat. Because like I said, those are specific areas and not just kind of small I important habitats for the species.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for mentioning that, Phil. I know, yeah, some people, depending on where you're at in the country, may not be as familiar with critical habitats. I know another resource that's been helpful is the online mapper for critical habitats. So if people just Google, you know, critical habitat, FWS online map, that'll typically get you to that site. And I know that's been helpful for others that are trying to sort of drill in to know, does their system actually overlap the locations? You know, if they maybe did a statewide query in IPAC or didn't have that information. So that's a useful resource there too.
I also want to mention that this is where you would be looking specifically at those physical and biological features that the service has described that are essential, kind of essential elements of the critical habitat. You'd be looking at those features when you're designing your AMMs for a certain critical habitat.
Great. Yeah, so maybe noting that in this column where we talk about those features, we have them sort of briefly summarized here, but that's a good highlight. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, again, this is an example. It's intended to provide sort of an idea of the level of information required and help you with your application. So next, just to finish off the guidance document here, we have 2 other sections that are, again, providing you some guidelines and some information to help you out. So we referred to IPAC as a way to generate that resource list. So on the pages below, we have sort of a screenshot, step-by-step way that you can walk through IPAC and generate that species list if you don't have it. And then also how you can use the species that are identified to then go to those species-specific pages, identify recovery plans, and again, where you can pull those AMMs that may already exist for those species. Not every species will have content within ECOS, so I think they're still working on sort of updating that, but there's a lot of great information there. And again, running IPAC to run that list is really, really helpful.
Dan, I mean, every species will have a species profile page. And for the most part, if there are things like recovery plans, for every species, you should be able to find the listing rules, recovery plans, 5-year reviews. And then we only recently, in the last few years, have ensured that every biological opinion written for that species is also available through ECOS. So it's possible you may only find recent biological opinions for a species, but those other kind of key documents, recovery plans, 5-year reviews, listing rules, critical habitat rules, should all be available through the species profile pages like this one.
Great, great. You know, when I've been on looking at certain species, it seems like there's more information for some than others, but it's good to know that some of those essential documents are there.
Yeah.
Great. So if you have species though that you can't find information for, we do also include then lastly this master list of potential avoidance minimization measures. And so we have this broken up by measures related to certain types of activities. And so you can use this to go and see, okay, what are the types of things that you might do for a avoidance minimization measure related to a certain type of activity. So this could be a good reference point, again, for when you're preparing your application. If it's difficult to come by avoidance minimization measures for the species at all versus maybe ones specifically for certain types of activities that you will be conducting on your enrolled lands, this resource can take you through it. And so again, these might not all apply to your situation, but we wanted to keep this list fairly broad and open and give lots of examples as a resource. So be sure to check this out and use that as needed on your application. Phil, anything you wanted to mention about these generalized AMMs?
I think these are the ones that we pulled out of we've got something called the Effects Pathway Manager. So these are all actual measures that were developed almost exclusively by Fish and Wildlife Service biologists. And so, yeah, it's a very large list. You should be able to find measures to apply to a lot of different situations here, and that you can modify as needed.
Yeah, I think it's a great resource. Even for people who have to consider for other projects outside the CCAA, types of avoidance minimization measures. It's a great collection of information there. Great. So that's the guidance document. Again, you'll find that on the toolkit. That is a really helpful resource to walk you through the application and again give you some examples. And so now to build on that, I wanted to go over and show a real life example that we received of avoidance minimization measure list. So this is essentially the attachment that was provided as part of their application. And so we've redacted the applicants' names just to make this generalized. Again, this would apply anywhere in the country in this type of format. And Phil, I can kind of walk through this and share, but I think one thing I do like about this is, they build on the example that we shared in the guidance document that we just reviewed, and then they also make it fairly clear and easy to use. So they have their AMMs listed. They have some references to further on the document where they define what these measures are, and then they've noted where they have overlap with suitable habitat, but then they highlight the species in particular whether it's a critical habitat or a plant that specifically is requiring those AMMs. And then, of course, there's the habitat notes as well. So did you have specific things that you wanted to point out, I guess, in regards to the species list overall that you liked here?
No, I agree with what you said. Yeah, it's very clear. And I like the fact that they drew out, I mean, they even drew out here the critical habitat in kind of a different shade. Things like that are, yeah, helpful when you're looking at a lot of these.
Definitely. Yeah, and as I'll scroll through this slowly, but we can see there's a lot of species here. So obviously, depending on the size of the enrolled lands and your location in the country, some areas will have dozens and dozens of species. Some areas will have, maybe 6 or fewer. So it can vary quite a bit. This one's very detailed and has a lot of species. So again, we thought it was a good example to share. And like how they call it, proposed critical habitat. That's often overlooked when people are looking at that aspect. So again, you can see that with all, again, the green highlights are the ones that have measures associated with them. Keep going through our species list. Again, there's quite a few. And then as we get to the bottom of the list, this is where we then get into what those avoidance minimization measures are. So they talk here about the types of projects that occur, or the types of activities. Again, this might be detailed elsewhere in their application. They decided to include it here for their purposes. Then they describe what their environmentally sensitive areas are and how that's defined for their operations. And then they talk about their BMPs and general, practices they use programmatically across their system. And then you can see here what their other measures and practices are. And so last, we do have the avoidance minimization measures that are included within that those highlighted sections of the table above. So you'll see we have their hydrology projections. So I run back up here real quick. You can see for these examples, they refer to hydrology 1, 2, 3. There's also some other veg measures. If we jump back down to that part of the application, you can see how those line up here. And so when they reference those, they're referencing these specific measures for those specific species. So again, their hydrology protections, they have their vegetation management protections, invasive species protections, specific habitat protections, and then training, training practices. So I thought it was a nice, clear way that they could pull together the species list and the AMMs. Phil, I know you've been reviewing this a lot more closely. Was there anything else you wanted to highlight that you liked about this application?
Yeah, I'd say the the measures are described clearly. They took advantage of the fact that they apply similar measures to locations where, for example, one or more, or they, one location where plant species A is present would get the same types of protective measures as a location where species B is present. And so they took advantage of that to, instead of repeatedly listing the narratives or for each measure, I think they did it here in a real kind of efficient way. And so, yeah, I think a key to this is it's, they're clearly stating the measures they're going to implement. So then, we would look to see, well, how are we going to be sure that they're going to know where those species are present, and where it's going to be necessary to implement these measures.
Great. Okay. Well, yeah, so that's the guidance. And this is the sort of other example we wanted to share. I guess, Phil, as we wrap up, was there any other highlights or considerations you wanted people to think about as they're preparing their application?
No, I think in some cases, don't hesitate to contact your local Fish and Wildlife Service field office, whether or not you've talked to them before. So I know some applicants have worked with those field offices quite a bit, especially departments of transportation. But if you want to run these by the local field office before you apply, that's fine. But know that we are going to coordinate with that field office after you submit your application.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Phil. And with that, as a reminder, check out the toolkit and the application guidelines there. And like you mentioned, reach out if there are any questions. We're happy to help. Thanks for your time.